Welcome to Amplifying Wellness with TLC podcast. This podcast is a place where we are dedicated to everyone's self-care and wellness. We will be sharing guest stories, information, and tips on how to live happy and healthy lives. We are Twin Life Coaching and Business Services with your hosts, myself, Barb Schutz, and my business partner and twin sister, Tara Lehman. We care about increasing awareness around self-care and mental health through our podcast, coaching, consulting, workshops, and our newest addition, our new communities. To find out more about all of our services, please visit www.twinlifecoaching.ca. As well, we always like to remind our listeners that this podcast is for sharing of stories and information only. It is not intended to be or replace any medical advice you are seeking or have received from your medical practitioner.
Today, we are joined by Aly Bird, an author, speaker, trainer, and coach. Welcome to the show, Aly.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So before we get to a very important topic, which is grief today, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background in wellness and self-care?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I actually became a life coach in 2018. So I've been in the wellness space for quite some time. But we'll get into a little bit of my story probably later.
Sure.
But in 2022, I went back to school and am now a registered psychotherapist with qualifying status in Ontario. So thank you. I'm a coach, I am a therapist, and I'm really passionate about bringing a social justice lens to the work that I do and making self-care something that happens alongside community care. So that it's not all on, we are meant to live in community. We are meant to connect with one another. And I think something that's really missing from our world right now is doing that work together and in support of one another. So come from a psychology coaching background and am now in the world of grief.
Awesome. Thank you.
So I guess we can just dive right into the grief piece there. And can you tell us why the topic of grief support is so important to you and, what values that holds for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I started doing coaching work I thought I knew what grief was. But after the unexpected death of my husband, I learned that it was so much more than I ever understood. And what I thought was just something like, if you felt it enough, if you confronted it enough, that ultimately one day you could overcome it. And what I've learned about grief is it's not something that you fix or you cure or you heal. It is something that you learn to live with. And I think there is a lot of misconceptions about what grief is and how we support people who are grieving in the Western world. And it's part of my mission to kind of teach people how to be the best kind of support that they can to the bereaved through a lens of grief literacy, and having conversations about grief out in the open, not something that happens behind closed doors. And that's all really informed by the death of my husband and the kind of care that I received from the people around me. There's a lot of conversation that happens in support groups for bereaved people. And I'd say anecdotally, 70% of the conversation is, I feel left behind, forgotten, and misunderstood. And in my own experience, not saying that it was great by any means, but I didn't feel those things from my community. There was a level of, unknowing that they could never learn unless they were in my shoes, but no one abandoned me. They were all willing to remain by my side. And I honestly attribute where I am now to the care that I received, in the first weeks, months, years, into my loss and my losses. And I just really want that for everyone.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I want to go back to something that you touched on. First of all, sorry to hear about your husband, of course. Um, but I want to touch back on how you say that people don't normally talk about these types of things. And it's interesting because we've talked about menopause on our podcast earlier, and it's something that people don't talk
Mm,
about either.
Yeah.
So when it comes to like those challenges of people just not talking about it, I mean, first of all, why don't we talk about it? I think it's extremely important. But what challenges are people facing? Like, why aren't we talking about it? Do you have any thoughts on
yeah.
that?
I have a couple thoughts. I think in terms of the why we don't talk about it, I think we've scienced our way into believing that we live forever.
Interesting.
Acknowledging that we're going to die one day is not something that a capitalist system like
Yeah,
acknowledges, right? Like a system where you keep your head down and you make as much money as you can and you just stay on the treadmill. Like thinking about death, there's no time for that.
mm,
And then on top of that, Western medicine, we try to save people and extend our lives. Like we don't know when to stop per se.
hmm
And people receive care in hospitals, people die in hospitals, and it's very much removed from our community. Whereas, you look back at the beginning of hospitals have existed for only such a short time. Funeral
true.
homes too, right? We used to die at home. The funeral parlor is from based on the language of the funeral used to be in the parlor of the
hmm
home, right? And we gathered as communities to mourn the loss, and we don't have that kind of tangible access to death anymore. If you want to learn about what it is like when someone dies, like we have to go to YouTube. Like there aren't those
Yeah.
narratives within our families or with our friends being like, oh, what does a dead body actually look like? What does the process of dying look like? And then being with that as you move into a space of grief. Um, and it's grief is uncomfortable, and
hmm
witnessing grief is uncomfortable too. And I think culturally we have a lot of challenge with staying in discomfort. We can do nearly anything to numb ourselves, distract ourselves,
Yeah.
um, to not feel discomfort. And grief is just something that is uncomfortable, and it can't be fixed. You can't bubble back your way out of grief. You can't,
hmm
you know, take the pill that makes it go away. And that really challenges what we've been taught about being able to move through pain and
Yeah.
discomfort.
Um, that's very interesting that you say these things because it made me think about how I'm hearing more and more that funerals or wakes or visitations since COVID really don't always happen anymore. So when
Yeah.
you think about the fact that we don't actually see, so to speak, the dead body or be able to
Yeah.
say those types of goodbyes, I mean, I think that's a newer challenge. Are you finding that in your practice? Are you seeing that at all?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I mean, I haven't seen that specific trend, to be honest,
Oh,
but I
good.
do know that ritual is important, right?
hmm
And whether there is a formal opportunity for the ritual, be it a funeral or a celebration of life or a wake, what have you, like you can do the formal thing, which is great, but you can also do it on your own as well.
Okay.
Um, So if it doesn't happen and it is something you are longing for, I would encourage someone to take on the activity and just do it on their own. Maybe it's with, their partner or a close friend. It's a
hmm
small, intimate group of people. You go graveside or plant something in their honor somewhere
Love
else,
it.
have some sort of ceremony to it. And it's never too late to do the ceremony. So if you were robbed of that opportunity because of COVID or because, after COVID, this isn't a trend, I would say that it's not something that like you have to rely on others to make it happen. Because that morning ritual is critical for many people to have some sort of outward expression of what that internal grief process is for them.
And you're right.
Yeah.
Better late than never.
Yeah, and I was going to add
Yeah.
to that, and it may sound like a silly thing, but when we think about when we have young children and their fish dies, and we put on a bit of a funeral for our child to get over that, and
Mhm.
the very next day they want a new fish. But when you think about that, it could actually be that's their first experience to something not being there anymore that was moving around and looking at them through the fishbowl or whatever. And it's such
Yeah.
sometimes we do more for those types of things than we do for our loved ones who say they don't want a funeral, or they don't want a celebration of life. But yeah, you're right. Like, I think those things actually help you get through it. So whether it's something small, like you said, like planting a plant or a tree, or just having a little backyard funeral for Goldie the goldfish, it's all the same in how you can put closure on it.
Mhm.
Absolutely, absolutely. And sorry, you said something there that reminded me of a story. Oh, um, what I think is important for people to know, there is a part of the mourning ritual that is for the person who died. Like I advocate for, taking as much ownership about that when you're alive so that it's easier for
Yeah.
people when you're dead. Um,
Mhm.
but I think it's important to remember that the mourning ritual, whether that I'm using mourning ritual for celebration of life or funeral, what have you,
Mhm.
that mourning ritual is not for the person who died per se. It is for the people who are grieving their death.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And I think that's something that a lot of people, as they're dying, they don't want people, what's that poem? It's like, do not stand at my grave and weep or what have you. But there is a reason why we stand at the grave and
Right.
weep. It's
Mhm.
an outlet for this really tumultuous, uncomfortable, foreign experience that's happening in our bodies. So it's also something to keep in mind.
Mhm.
Mhm. Going back to earlier, you mentioned about how when you were going through the grief of your husband, that you had a really good support, a good community behind you. So, what are some of the things that, if somebody has a loved one passed away, or, going through even somebody hasn't passed away yet, but they're terminally ill, like what are the things that family and friends can do, or what worked best for you to have, what supports should we be wanting or asking others to give us, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I love this question, and I teach this in my book, which we'll probably talk about at the end of this conversation. But I think I advocate that there's kind of like a framework that you should understand before you take action to support someone who is bereaved or someone experiencing some sort of like anticipatory grief. And the first part of it's a three-part lesson. The first
Mhm.
thing that you need to give that person is respect, utter respect for
Yeah.
what their unique experience with grief is, because grief is unique for everyone. Some people, it might be, a wild emotional experience. For others, it's more physical symptoms. For others, it's more of a spiritual activity. It's different for everyone. So you have to really respect that person's unique experience. The second one is empowerment. So you need to empower that person to do and ask for whatever it is that is going to help them survive something that is happening to them that they don't have any control over.
Mhm.
It is happening without their consent or permission. That is grief.
Yeah.
So empowering them to do what is best for them. And then the third is just providing unconditional love, because it is going to be hard to stand next to someone who is essentially like, some losses can bring you back to kind of like infancy. They shatter all your assumptions about the world and how it works and
Mhm.
how you exist in it. And it is a process of growing and navigating and charting what life looks like again. And that's hard to stand next to someone and say, I'm going to love you no matter what, whatever you
Mhm.
look like at the, like, 2, 3, 10 years down the road, like I'm going to love you no matter what. So, and then you fall back on the next 2 months. So do whatever it is that you need to do to survive this. And I completely respect what it is that you are going through. So with that framework, then I would offer, what can you do to make that person's life easier and more comfortable?
Mhm.
Stay away
Mhm.
from fixing, because we can't fix grief. grief happens because, there's a change in attachment, often because it's a death. And the only thing that would fix it would be to bring that person back from the dead. And we haven't figured out how to do that yet. So
Nope.
don't try and fix it. Focus on comfort, focus on ease. And with that, another step forward is focus on what you're really good at already. We get the narrative of send food, bring flowers, and you don't have to focus on food if you're not good at food, right? You have other strengths and resources. And it's important to just do what it is that you are good at, because that's what you're going to be the best at.
Yeah.
And that's what they need. They need your best if you are going to stand next to someone through the long haul of grief.
And maybe that's even like cleaning up after
Yes.
a celebration of life, or, saying, I'm going to come clean your house once a week for a month or whatever,
Yes.
right? You're like flowers, you're right. Like flowers, maybe not what you're able to give. So, or food, not all of us can cook, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Right. Like I have a friend who's not, like, poor girl, like not a kitchen person by any, I'm not a great kitchen person either, but like she showed up at my door with like Kleenex and Ritz crackers and she's like, I'm here.
Yeah.
Oh,
right.
that's
But
awesome.
she has a brilliant mind and her attention to detail, and she's a lawyer. So she helped me with the legal process, like afterwards.
Oh, that's great.
Like there are so many
that.
strengths that every individual has, and interests too, right? Like you don't have to do food.
Yeah.
I
And
love
I want,
it.
oh, sorry. I wanted to also comment on the flowers. So I unfortunately had 4 losses through the summer. And one of them, there was a traditional funeral for. And the mom, it was somebody who is disabled. I also work with disabled people. So somebody who passed away fairly young. And her mom, she's like, I don't want all these flowers here because they'll die too. So when you're in the mindset of
Yeah.
somebody just died unexpectedly, and then people are giving you things that are dying, sometimes I agreed with her. I thought, yeah, that would actually make my grief worse because I'm watching these things also die that was at, my daughter's funeral. And I thought that is a really interesting comment that she said. And it makes a whole lot of sense about what we're talking about right now, that we have to be also mindful of what we're doing to provide that support so that it's not something that the person's, depending on the state that they're in their mind, takes that as a negative or as something that makes them sadder, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, like Barb, that brings up a great point, is that, because everyone's grief experience is so unique, that, those people who sent flowers, like they had their like the person's best
Absolutely.
interest at heart, obviously, but they missed the mark. That
Mhm.
that mom didn't want flowers. And it's quite possible, you could internalize that and be like, oh no, I did something wrong. But I really advocate for like the mindset in grief support is that you're doing it right if you're making mistakes, right? So
Yeah.
if you were a person who sent the flowers and they weren't received in a positive way, like apologize for sending them and move on, right? Try something else. Like the worst thing that you can do, like how you get grief support wrong, is making a mistake or being afraid to make a mistake and then disappearing because of your own, desire for perfection. And you can't be perfect in grief support. Everybody's experience is too unique for you to be able to show up and not get anything wrong. So it's really important to have the mindset that like make mistakes, learn from them. And actually that's how relationships get stronger, is when you apologize and just keep moving forward.
Yeah. Or even asking the person, what can I do to help? I think a lot of people forget that part too. And, sometimes you get some really insightful way that they just want, I don't know, they just want someone to spend a couple of days with them, or, they just want someone to talk to, or whatever the case may be. So yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah. I think it's a good point too, Barb, is that like, it's great to ask like, how can I help? But I would also argue that like, do that reflection of like, what am I really good at first, and offer it up, saying like, I'm here to help you in whatever way, like, please let me know, but here's like X, Y, and Z things that I know that I can offer you and do a really good job at.
That's a great idea.
To take the pressure off that person, because they are going to be flooded with let me know if you need anything. Let me know if I can help you.
I love that idea of offering something you're good at doing, or you can be confident in doing. I like that idea. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, because I want to switch it to businesses because we've all lost somebody at work, and some companies, what day do
Mhm.
you need off?
Yeah.
And in a lot of times, one day, I mean, if it's a spouse or, immediate family member, not going to cut it. If you were to give a piece of advice to the business community that might be listening to us in our audience, what would you say a change a change that they could do that could potentially start to fix what the business world sees compared to what is needed, if that makes sense?
Oof, that is a big question.
Yeah, I know.
Um,
Oh, sorry.
yeah. I mean, I think we could like entirely like overhaul whatever the bare minimum is,
Hmm.
like three
More
days of
time.
bereavement leave if like obviously like more time, but I also recognize that, sometimes like whatever is being offered will probably not be enough, right? You could
Yeah.
say like someone's going to need a year, someone's going to need 2 years, someone's going to need 3 years, and it still might not be enough. And I think there's just a larger problem that may not be solved in my lifetime. I will hold hope. Um, but I think we need a greater and more grief literate world to recognize how grief changes people.
Hmm.
And like, I don't want to put like a lens of like disability on it, but there's a level of accessibility that needs to be considered when someone
Yeah.
is bereaved. Like grief can manifest as a brain injury, and yet we like you are cognitively impaired. Sometimes you're physically impaired, and asking someone to return to work after 3 days, like they're not giving you their best, right? Like if they
Hmm.
are employee, like they might be present, but they're not as efficient as they probably were before the death. Um,
Would you
so
agree
I
then
guess like
probably
just
mental health support is probably a key one, do you think? If I mean
in
offering,
the
I'm not
in
saying, forcing,
yeah,
right?
yeah, I
Yeah.
mean like in the interim, like a mental
Hmm.
health support is great, but I also think like the depth of our grief illiteracy in the
Yeah.
world right now like forces
Yeah.
people to go to mental health support
I
because they
agree.
everybody recognize like everybody sees them in a state of discomfort and is like, oh, do you need to talk to someone? Where like
Hmm.
as humans, like we have the capacity to actively listen to someone. Like
Hmm.
often the three main things that a grieving person needs is like validation, witnessing, and maybe a little bit of guidance. Like that can get someone through the long haul
Yeah.
of grief, but often we don't even give them that, right? Like we've
Hmm.
given them the 3 days. We think they should be over it. They're back at work. Therefore, like you should be who you were, 5 days before your parent
Yeah.
died or
Yeah.
your sibling died or your best friend died. Even if your pet died,
Hmm.
right? Like
Yes. Yeah.
these are big things. And I think the mental health supports are places where people right now can get that validation and witnessing and guidance. But I wish that we lived in a world that recognized that grief changes us and we are allowed to change because of it, not go talk to someone and fix yourself so you can
Hmm.
jump back into the system and help us continue making money.
Yeah,
We need more people like you doing what
that's
you
right.
do so that there's more talk about it and more
There you go.
Yes.
acceptance around
Yes.
it.
If you are listening to this, I will come to your company. I will help. I
See,
will be
there we
on your
go.
podcast. Hire me. I am
Let's
available.
spread the news. Let's
Yeah.
Yeah.
talk. Great.
Well, I was going to ask you about what one of your biggest pieces of advice were, but I think you've already touched on a few of them. So I'm not, do you have any others? I mean, the three that you just said, for providing that kind of support to somebody, those are great. I love those.
Yeah.
Was there anything else that you wanted to add, or is that where you have the most
Yeah,
important
I
piece
mean,
of
I would absolutely start there, and it might be too much to offer anybody else anymore at this point, but I'd say like I
yeah.
lay all of that out in my book Grief Ally. It starts with those, teaching those three basic principles of grief support. It talks about how you can't fix grief, and then it gives you a whole way of showing up that I think everybody would be better off, bereaved and their allies, in a world where people die.
Yeah. And like I said, talk, right? Let's not be afraid about the topics that everybody kind of just pushes aside. Let's talk about it. I think that helps everybody, and it can help change how we see it as a society and as in the business world even, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. If our audience wanted to learn more about you or maybe find where your book could be purchased, how can they find you online?
Yeah, so you can go to my website, which is alybird.com, which is just ALY and bird like bird, or on social media, which is the Aly Bird. And you can buy my book, Grief Ally, on all the major platforms where you buy books. So Amazon, Indigo, Chapters, Barnes and Noble, Audible, Apple Books, Google
Awesome.
Books. Yeah, anywhere you buy books, you can get it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for talking to us about an extremely important topic, and we really hope that our audience will also start talking about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you to our listeners for joining us today. We can't wait to bring you more Amplifying Your Wellness with us and with guest stories like Aly's, sharing challenges, wins, and tips to help you on your self-care and wellness journeys. As a reminder, our new Amplifying Your Wellness with TLC community is a great place to find support for everything you need with regards to life and more. To find out more about our community and all of our services, please visit twinlifecoaching.ca. Until next time, remember, you've got this.